Hello students, and welcome to our discussion of Chapter 15. So Chapter 15 is on the physical and cognitive development that happens in late adulthood. So present in our lecture today is my cat River over here. So River is a Siamese cat, very pretty. It's got a really good coat of fur and pretty smart too. So I've had lots of cats, and this one's probably the smartest. And then our other cat, which will probably run around here at some point, sitting in a chair off camera over here, that cat's one of the less intelligent cats I've had. It likes to try and eat everything. Play-Doh off the floor. Yeah, we got it as a stray though, so I think it grew a lot of its life in a survival mode before we got it. So it just showed up on our doorstep one day with a broken paw. And this is completely unrelated to Chapter 15, but there you go. A little story about my cats. So River we got as a kitten from a client's family that I was working with. And then Shadow just showed up on our doorstep with a broken foot. Took care of it. Costs quite a bit to repair the cat's foot, so I was like, well, sunk cost fallacy, we're going to keep this cat. And, it's the favorite of my kids, so that's good, even though it's my less favorite cat. Anyway, let's talk about physical development in late adulthood, as well as cognitive development. So to get started, let's watch a couple videos that really demonstrate what positive aging in late adulthood looks like. So we've got a couple good videos here. I'm going to watch the two middle ones. Dr. Nakamura is actually one of my professors at Claremont Graduate University, so I took a bunch of my development courses from her.
My name is Jean Nakamura, and I study aspects of positive adult development, including mentoring in the professional context and social innovation in the second half of life. We've been studying social innovators who are all over the age of 60, so in their 60s, 70s, 80s. We were interested in the question of how they came to be doing what they're doing. And the vast majority of them aren't people who were actively seeking something to do to contribute to society, and they weren't people who were tapped because of their expertise to do something to contribute to society. There were people who had sort of stumbled into a problem that they felt they couldn't ignore. And wound up feeling like they needed to take it on themselves. One example of
So the example that she gives in a minute is a really good one of that, but I just wanted to kind of jump in here and say, in a lot of work on civic engagement and purpose in life, we find that a lot of the people that are building successful kind of programs to help people in their individual communities kind of followed that same pattern. Is that they saw a problem, they thought, well, maybe some of my skills can help it, or maybe I can organize people to solve this problem, and those essentially grassroots creations end up creating some of the most effective, they're not always effective. It's not like if that's your motivation and that's how you're starting it, you're definitely going to succeed, but it's very often that they see the needs, they have ties to the community, they have people around them, other stakeholders that they can call on for resources, whether it be like a teenager and their principal or a teacher or a mentor in the area that can help them, or like a business owner they know, things like that, versus an older adult in late adulthood has these skills and talents that they already have, probably has a little bit wider social network, or knows a little bit better how to go about organizing things like that. But it can be a really effective way to go about civic engagement. Kind of tangential, but relevant to other areas of the lifespan too. But let's listen to the example of positive aging doing this method.
these lives organized around social purpose was an individual who had been a war vet, and when he was being treated in a VA hospital, was observing the young soldiers who had come back from the Gulf War, and realized that one of his own passions, which was fly fishing, might be something that he could share with them. And he created a program that allowed war veterans to go out into the country and experience a very restorative kind of healing activity. So essentially he was taking his own flow experiences and sharing them with these veterans. Yeah, so we've been learning from the research that we're conducting on the daily lives of older individuals whose lives are centered around a social purpose, that the work has both emotional and experiential costs, but also benefits, and that the benefits, like seeing the impact of one's work on others, outweigh the costs. Sort of traditional scripts for the retirement years are sort of centered around leisure. And the research that we're doing presents alternative possibilities. This has been called sort of the encore career, and the notion that another possible pathway for those years is giving back in one way or another.
So you might see some of the messages that I've tried to share with you through Lifespan coming through in some of that discussion from Dr. Nakamura. And a lot of that's because a lot of my developmental theory, a lot of my developmental learning was guided by Dr. Nakamura. So that's one of the reasons I kind of emphasize there needs to be more research in the last part of life. And also middle adulthood, because we don't have as much research there, but it's really important. People can have well-being and have thriving, great lives even well into their adulthood. So that's one thing that she's very passionate about. She kind of passed on that passion to me, and hopefully I pass that on just a little bit to you, even if you're not going to go into doing research. If that's what you want to do, well, I know a lot about that, so let me know if you need letters of recommendation or sources to go to or things like that, if that's kind of the course that you want to do. But hopefully you do see the lifespan, at whatever point in the lifespan you are now, as something that can be enjoyed and you can be thriving at any given point, despite whatever risk factors or protective factors that surround you in your context. Any individual has the capacity to still grow, develop, change, do positive things in their communities, do positive things for themselves, and improve their environment and have a good life, essentially. So a lot of positive psychology is about living a good life. And what does that mean? And so in the sense of aging, one of the key things is finding things that are purposeful or really meaningful, that you can be engaged with, and even giving back to people. So that's really important in that latter part of life. So let's watch another example of positive aging from another family. So we kind of get here someone in kind of middle adulthood as well as late adulthood talking about their lives.
This is me, and this is my mother. There are nearly 40 years between us. I'd like to be like her when I get old, an 81-year-old who's full of beans.
Sure, I could come over here every day and do my gymnastics in the park.
People in Germany are getting older, and as long as their health holds out, they continue to be active as they age. How old do you feel?
Oh, that's a tough question. I usually ask people how old they think I am. But how old do I feel? I'd say mid-60s or so. Certainly not as old as I really am, thank goodness.
What's your life motto?
My motto in life is to try to not come to a standstill, to stay active, continue to look for and experience new things. When you come across something new, don't think, oh, you don't need to try that, it's not worth it at your age. But just give it a go.
That attitude makes people like my mother attractive for many companies. These so-called youthful seniors want to lead independent lives, and that means they're an important part of consumer society. And they're not averse to modern technology. Do you see how the colours are changing? That happens a lot on the internet. When you swipe over something with the mouse and the color changes, then you know you can click on it. It's like a button you can push.
Okay, but it's not doing anything. Why isn't it reacting?
My mother's generally unfazed even when things get complicated.
I'm pretty persistent. Once I've started something and feel I need to learn how to do it, then I stick with it until I can, even if it's difficult. And I have to swear at myself a little. I say, Biggie, don't be stupid. Just keep on trying. I give myself a little pep talk, and that usually works.
For my mother, taking trips is a way of staying active in old age. Travel-loving seniors have become a lucrative market for tour operators. Special travel clubs offer package tours for them. My mother's happy to spend her money on that and make her remaining years pleasant.
I don't spend much time dwelling on the future. Who knows what might happen in a week or in 6 months? I try not to think about that too much. I don't feel old, and I hope that's the way it stays for a while.
Living in the here and now. I think that's a good attitude to have at any age.
So a lot of different things in that video that are related to positive aging. So one is trying new things, being open to new experience. You can see how this might be related to some of those personality characteristics that we talked about last time. Some of those in the big five, like openness to experience. Other aspects that are helpful for positive aging are trying to stay engaged with things like work. Leisure can be really useful and helpful as well. So hopefully you saw some good examples there of what it can really look like to age positively. So let's go over some of the research in this area as well. All right, so Csikszentmihalyi and Rathun. So Csikszentmihalyi and Dr. Nakamura do a lot of projects together, or they have over the course of their careers. This is one Csikszentmihalyi did with Rathun, and basically this is just notes from a research article, kind of as a reminder of like what it is about. So actually I used this specific little note card to study for my oral qualifying exam towards my dissertation. So some funny memories and stress associated with this specific image. But with it, the main point of this article is that it was looking for successful aging or positive aging. What were the common things that people who were aging well or felt a lot of well-being as they age, what did they feel were the most important things to them? So those were 6 things. One was health and fitness. So those that had better health felt more well-being, felt like they could do more. Those that stayed fit, doing gymnastics in the park, for example, things like that, helped them feel better overall throughout their lifespan. Trying to preserve their mind, so doing what they could to exercise their mind, to learn new skills, to use the capacities they had, doing things like games. There's actually a whole lot of apps now that are essentially brain games, and I would recommend talking to, say, your doctor or a psychologist or a psychiatrist who's practicing therapy to ask what some of those are, because those can be even really useful early on in life too. So continuing vocations was also something that was really common in people who are successfully aging. So with that, that doesn't have to be only doing a job. It can be like these examples of people with social purpose that found something that they wanted to fix in the community, and they worked, and that essentially became their job. So it doesn't have to be paid work, but some kind of thing that you're going to very regularly and engaging in and working on. Another big thing is keeping up those relationships with family and friends. So hopefully you've seen that this is a really key repetitive piece throughout the lifespan, that other people really matter. So having those close connections with family and with friends really help people have a lot more well-being into late life. And help them live longer, help them live happier, give them supports to rely on when bad things happen, maybe health does start failing, those kinds of things. staying involved in the community. And you can see how some of these might connect to each other. So your friends are probably in your community, your vocation that you're doing might be in the community, the things that you're doing in the community might be engaging your mind, might be more active, help with health and fitness. And this goes along with the last one of beyond the self engagement. So we've talked about that in relation to purpose in life. But for people who are focused on things beyond themselves, giving back, being generative, it's very helpful for extending their lifespan, helping them feel more well-being, helping them keep that health and fitness up. So all these things are very related, all very big protective factors, and probably a lot of them causal as well in their effect on the lifespan and well-being and living a long time. So with that, let's talk about longevity. So longevity is essentially just the life expectancy or your lifespan. So let's talk about some biological theory. Or lifespan is the maximum number of years you could live. So it looks to be for humans about 120 to 125 years is probably about the maximum we can expect, unless there's some dramatic changes in a few things, and we'll talk about biological and other theories of aging in a second. So estimates for the US by 2030 were that it would be about 83.3 years on average for women and 79.5 years on average for men. So some earlier will die, some later, those kinds of things. So there are differences in life expectancies across countries, things like health conditions, medical care, ethnic differences, these all factor into it. So these are other aspects of context that are going to affect how long people will tend to live. So centenarians, people who live to be 100, or that are 100 or older. So they're increasing at a rate of about 7% each year in industrialized countries. So that's quite a lot. So more and more people every single year have been growing past 100. So the highest rate of centenarians in the world is actually in Okinawa, Japan. And there are 34.7 centenarians for every 100,000 inhabitants. So that's a pretty big number compared to the rest of the world, to other communities. There's some other communities that have a pretty high rate of centenarians, but this is the highest. And their comment here in this picture, because we have a lot of fish in this village, that'll come into play in a minute of why maybe the people here are living a little longer. So, because one of the things that this seems to be attributed to when looking at these longitudinal studies and doing correlational studies, trying to figure out what it is about people in this community that helps them live to 100 and past, one of the big things is they share a similar diet. They eat a lot of fish, they eat very lean meats, they have a lot of vegetables, a lot of fruits. So their diet, and I think your book goes into a little more detail on their diet as well. And they have a very low stress lifestyle, so they're able to not have a lot of stress on them. They're not going to, say, a job that's really stressful. They're able to choose some passions that they're enjoying and work towards those, and it's not as stressful for them. They have a lot of community. So this goes to that being involved in your community as well as friends part. When you have a community that can support you, that gives you a lot more resources to gather from. So that kind of a little bit more collectivism than we necessarily see in the US probably attributes or contributes to this as well. They're a lot more active than other people around the world who are getting to that age, and it's really common for people that are getting that old in Okinawa to still be very active. So it's part of the culture rather than we imagine people who are getting older here in the US oftentimes in, say, a retirement home or something like that. Also, they all have high levels of spirituality, so that might be part of the reason why they find meaning through that as well. So all these seem to be contributing factors, some of them correlational, some of them might be causal, of why these people in this specific place are aging well for so long. So with this, here are the risks from dying from different cancers in Okinawa versus the US. So you can see here Okinawa numbers, so cancer rates per 100,000 people versus Japan in general versus the US. So there are some differences there. So some other theories of aging that might apply to this as well and apply to everybody aging are some evolutionary theories of aging. So natural selection has not done as much to eliminate many harmful conditions and non-adaptive characteristics in older adults. So older adults are aging, organs are failing, for example, towards the end of life. Natural selection hasn't done as much to weed out those kinds of biological problems, you might say, as things closer to reproductive age. So the benefits of evolution kind of decline with age because natural selection is trying to select for things that help people reproduce better, more healthily, more efficiently, more effectively, those kinds of things. So with that, having supportive older adults around does help with that process, with being able to take care of young children, build a community. So there is an aspect of natural selection in aging, but it doesn't do as much to weed out some of those problems that we have biologically. So there's also an idea called the cellular clock theory. It's the idea that cells can divide only about a maximum of 75 to 80 times. So with that would be different cells in your body. Some cells in your body don't really divide and kind of replace themselves. So your neurons, for example, don't do that, but your skin cells do that, as an example, and some other organ cells in your body do that as well. So age does make cells less capable of dividing, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why, and that is telomerase, or telomeres. I've heard it both ways, so let's say telomeres, telomerase, telomeres. That sounds better to me as I'm saying it. So telomeres are the end portion of your chromosomes. So it's made of DNA sequences that aren't really useful for coding genes. So here we see the cell, the nucleus, and in there we've got a bunch of chromosomes. So here's the chromosome. All this blue part is DNA that's coding for different traits. So eye color, propensity for depression, things like that. And then here at the end, there's still a bunch of DNA there. It's still the same molecule, but it's not actually used to code genes. It seems that we've evolved this capacity to have a bunch of extra DNA at the end of those chromosomes because it protects these chromosomes, these important ones that code genes. For every time that cell divides, it has the potential to kind of accidentally chop off some of the ends of that DNA. It's like you're reading a page in a book and you kind of know where it's going now. Maybe you get close to the end and you don't read the last couple words. It's kind of like that. When all the DNA in this whole chromosome is getting copied, that RNA the process kind of reads through most of that, but then it gets towards the end and doesn't read the last little bit. So that last little bit is not copied. So every time that chromosome's getting a little bit shorter. And eventually it gets to a point where that chromosome shortening cuts into those genetic traits that are really essential for survival, for organs to work properly, for your body to work properly, those kinds of things. So bigger, more zoomed in. So here is the chromosome with the DNA with genes that are coded or that can be read from that DNA. Then the telomere here is the end point. You could call it a cap. It's essentially just a cap of more of that DNA molecule that can be sacrificed for every time that it's divided. So this kind of gives another example of it shortening as time goes on. So you've got the cells, it divides one time, it's a little shorter, divides again, it's a little more short, divides again. So eventually that cell division stops because now you're eating into the essential functions that the DNA is able to send messages or code for different genes and proteins. So another idea is the free radical theory. And so this is the idea that people age because their normal metabolic processes, like how the cell is using energy, produces oxygen molecules as just a byproduct, kind of like car exhaust. So oxygen molecules are just produced in some of these cellular processes of using energy. And those oxygen molecules are actually ions. So what it means is it's an oxygen molecule that's not quite stable. So it's either too positive or too negative, and that can actually damage the DNA inside cells. So that's what that's talking about. Sorry about that. Vivint salesperson came by. It's late. It's late to come by. It's dark, but I had my window open because there was some natural light when I started recording this lecture, but now there's not. So they could see me, so they're like, oh, come and talk to them. Who knows, maybe their car was broken down and they wanted help or something, but yeah. I was just like, I'm in the middle of work. Leave me be. Sorry if any of you have done that kind of job, going door to door. Usually I'm a little more polite, but yeah, I was like, I'm in the middle of recording a lecture. I don't want to have to edit a piece out of this because my computer's quite slow when I try to edit things, so I'd prefer to avoid that. Maybe my computer got some free radicals and it's dying. I don't know. Kidding. No, that's not actually. It's because the metal components or whatnot circuits wear out over time. Anyway, another theory for biological aging is the mitochondrial theory. Basically that the mitochondria within the cell, which are the powerhouse of the cell, hopefully everybody knows that, that they essentially decay, that they age over time. They're not able to function as well. If they're not able to function well, then the cell's function doesn't work, and so organs fail, things like that. So another one is sirtuin theory, which is it's a family of proteins. It's linked to longevity. It's linked to mitochondria regulation and how it uses that energy, and it's also related to DNA repair and aging. Your book talks about it just briefly, and then there's also the mTOR pathway theory, which is the idea that there's a cellular pathway involving the regulation and growth of metabolism, and so essentially it's how cells kind of regulate their own growth, how they regulate their own way that they're eating and functioning. Because if the cells themselves are not functioning properly, well, then the organs they create, like skin or a stomach or a kidney or a brain, are also not going to be functioning correctly. And so if a lot of that happens, it gets to a point where your body can't really repair it, so it kind of falls apart essentially. So there's also the hormonal stress theory, that aging in the body's hormone system can lower resistance to stress and increase the likelihood of disease. So essentially that your immune system is more easy to be compromised as you're aging, partly because the hormones aren't working the same way that they were in, say, your 30s, as an example. So a couple other things we'll talk about with physical development in late adulthood. One is the brain specifically. So the brain, after you get to be about 23, it kind of starts losing mass throughout life. It's really slow, like you're not going to be able to tell a difference probably 1 year to the next, but over the course of the lifespan, the brain loses about 5 to 10% of its weight. So why might that be? Why might the brain be losing that much volume throughout the lifespan? So think about what you know about how the brain is constructed, how it works together, what neurons look like, how they work. So with that, it's because of things like shrinking of neurons. The neurons themselves, the cells that send the message, they shrink a little. Part of that's because of dendrites or axon branches shrinking back up into it. And part of that's because of pruning things that we don't need. So we also lower the number of synapses. If there's fewer axon or dendrite branches, then there needs to be fewer like connection points, synapses. The axons might get shorter, might have fewer branches of both axons and dendrites. And it literally adds up enough to be about 5 to 10% of the weight of the brain. So with that, if you have more of that aspect of the dendrites of your brain that are lost over time, you're probably going to have lost more capacities than if you've lost less over time. So what are ways that we grow those dendrites and axon branches? Think back if you can remember that. So essentially it's from using it. So that's why doing things like being engaged in the community, finding things that you're passionate about and you're working and engaged and open to new experience. This is why a lot of these things help you live longer. One, because physical, like you're probably more fit, you're doing more things rather than sitting all day or lying down a lot, as well as you're engaging your brain. If you play games, those apps that I mentioned, it's helping so that these dendrites aren't shrinking. So you're gaining new ones, you're gaining new cognitive capacities. Maybe you try to learn a language when you turn 80. So these are things that will help your brain last for a long time. So with that, things like physical coordination, intellectual performance, these are all related to things like those synapses, the neurotransmitters, the axons, the dendrites. So neurogenesis, we've talked about this before, it's generating new neurons. It doesn't seem like the human brain really does this very much, other than in the I always mix these two up, hippocampus or hypothalamus. It's one of those two. I'm pretty sure it's hippocampus. It's one of those two, though. Double check in your book to make sure that I've got the right one. They both start with H, and I often just switch them around. So but it only happens in that one specific area of the brain. It doesn't seem like humans have much neurogenesis, new stem cell neurons developing into new neurons anywhere else in the brain. We might find that that's not the case later on in the future, but for now this is as best as we know. There is dendrite growth, so that can happen up until the time you die, essentially. You can grow new dendrites, you can make new connections. This is why using the brain is so important in late adulthood. So older brains, if they lose capacity in a specific area, similar to brain damage that we talked about earlier in the class, if there's capacity lost in any specific area, the brain can kind of rewire around to work in a very similar or the same fashion, or even better, by growing new dendrites, new axon branches. So there is a decrease in lateralization in the brain in later adulthood. So usually as we age, we start to use both hemispheres to process information rather than just one side for specific tasks. So we've talked before about how language is pretty much centered like right over here. Well, the way that you're watching the screen, it might not be the same size. The left side of your brain, essentially, near the back kind of, is where you're processing language. So as you age, that kind of does spread out throughout other areas of the brain. This does help improve cognitive function. So here's an example of that. Here, younger adults are using that area of the brain, and older adults for the same task, for this memory recall task, are using both halves of their brain. So that can help improve performance. You've got to make new connections to be able to do that, so your brain is still developing even into late adulthood in this way. So again, development is not just growth, it's growth, maintenance, as well as loss, any kind of change essentially. So we've changed from focusing on this part of the brain for this specific task to using more of our brain for that specific task. So some things you might notice physically from people in late adulthood, things like wrinkles and age spots on the skin. They might be getting shorter because of bone loss. We've talked about this before, but specifically it's often due to bone loss in their vertebrae. So my great-grandmother, as she aged, she very clearly, her spine arched and it shrunk, so she was often shorter the next times I saw her as I was growing taller, because I was in early adolescence, as an example. So weight does seem to drop off after age 60. A lot of that comes from muscle loss, but also things like bone loss as well. Exercise is really beneficial for maintaining these capacities like muscle and bone, but losing this bone loss, losing this muscle mass does put older adults at risk of falls. So also means that they're generally moving more slowly. One interesting thing is that generally older adults don't actually fall and break their hips. Usually it's that, I mean, that obviously can happen. Usually it's that just in day-to-day walking around, doing things, their hip breaks and that causes them to fall, which I find really interesting that the bones can lose that much capacity, so that just doing normal everyday things, just stepping up a step onto a stair, might cause a hip to break. So here's some examples of the percentage differences of things like muscle, fat, bone, and whatnot from about 25 to 75. So some other senses or physical aspects of development are sensory development. So vision generally declines. This is both in acuity, so how easy it is to see things, how clear or sharp things are, the color, as well as depth perception. So cataracts are the thickening of the eye's lens that causes the vision to become cloudy, opaque, distorted, makes it hard to change your focus as well. Glaucoma is damage to the optic nerve itself, so the nerve that's actually going from your eye into your brain because of pressure created by fluid buildup in the eye. Then there's also macular degeneration. So that's a deterioration of the retina, and so that corresponds, usually causes this kind of problem. You can see in the image here. So the retinas, we have a lot of rods and cones in that specific spot of our eye. If those are deteriorating, then that part of the greatest focus becomes a part where essentially could be even blind. So the circulatory system and lungs are obviously really important parts of our biology. So there is an increase in cardiovascular disorders for older adults. High blood pressure is more common in men than women, and it is linked to illness, obesity. Oh, there's my cat again, wiggling on the ground. I guess this way. Sorry, it's kind of hard to point in the mirror or in a mirrored screen. High blood pressure can also be linked to stiffening of blood vessels, which can cause other problems as well, and a lack of exercise. So lung capacity tends to drop about 40% between ages 20 to 80. So that's some of the reason why certain respiratory viruses are much more dangerous for people that are closer to late adulthood. So sleep, 50% of older adults report having difficulty sleeping. So that doesn't give me a lot of optimism for my sleep in the future, but we will see. That's linked to health and mental health problems. We've talked about a lot of these problems. A lot of the same kind of problems that can happen from not sleeping well still can happen in late adulthood. So linked to lower levels of cognitive functioning. Sleeping too much also predicts earlier mortality from essentially all causes. So what is too much? I don't think your book ever specified what is too much. So look for the reference there, because right now I'm really curious, but I can't remember what too much was qualified as. Is that like 14 hours a day, 11 hours, 8 hours? How much is too much sleep? Too much sleep sounds like a great problem to have for me at my developmental level, though. So vision, we talked about some of these things. Again, there seems to be a really sharp difference from about age 65 to 75 and older. So at about 65 to 75, there's a loss of acuity, even with corrective lenses, less transmission of light through the retina. But then once you hit 75 and older, there's a significant loss of color discrimination, visual acuity, the visual field shrinks, so kind of getting tunnel vision as you age. And then at late adulthood, people are at a lot more risk for things like cataracts and glaucoma. So we kind of see a line there at about 75 where things can go quite a bit worse quite a bit quicker. So part of that might be because of a lot of this biological aging that we've talked about. Those telomeres, for example. If the cells in, say, the eye or something like that are not dividing as much as they should be, or they're now having problems after they divide, so the cells aren't working properly because part of their genetic code is now gone, that can lead to a lot of these problems. So for hearing, there is significant loss for hearing even at about 65, but these losses can be helped by a hearing aid. And then once you get to about 75 and on, a hearing aid is a lot more likely to be needed, and again, it's kind of just more likely that a hearing aid will be needed. So the most prevalent chronic conditions in middle and late adulthood are arthritis, hypertension, hearing impairments, and heart conditions. And you can see how the risk for each of these kind of increases once you get to 65 and then beyond. So it gets even higher risk after you hit 75 as well. So with this, So with that, this is the comorbidity of chronic conditions. So having something like diabetes as well as a chronic pain, or having arthritis as well as hypertension. So it gets more common as you age. So what are some other health problems? Well, the probability of having diseases or illness increases with age. So catching things like a common cold or the flu, that increases with age. It also slows the onset as well as the duration of diseases as well. So a lot of older adults have cardiovascular diseases. So with that, this jumps in at about 75 to 84 and 85. So with that, cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death for that age group because it becomes that much more common. So many people have that. So doing things that can prevent cardiovascular disease are very essential for living a long life. So some of those things we talked about with those centurions, who live to be 100 are going to help fight cardiovascular disease. So arthritis is a disease inflammation of joints accompanied with pain, stiffness, and movement problems. So you might see that in the hands or knees and other joints. Osteoporosis is a lot of loss of bone tissue. So this can lead to things like easier bone breaks, things like that. Accidents are the 8th leading cause of death. And falls are a leading cause of injury and death for adults over 65. So with that, again, a lot of times it's actually a process of a hip or limb breaking and then falling because of that. So exercise is, just as it is in all other areas of the lifespan, it is essential for increased longevity and the prevention of a lot of these chronic diseases. So it's associated with improved treatment of these diseases. So someone who does have a cardiovascular disease but has been exercising and continues to, their prognosis is much, much better. So it improves a lot of cellular functions and a lot of functions of the immune system. So exercise is essential. So it reduces the likelihood also of developing mental health problems. A lot of things like your neurotransmitters are being kept in their proper managed state. So you're getting essentially serotonin, oxytocin, things like that running, whereas if you're just sitting watching TV, that might not be happening. So reduces the negative effects of stress. So it's a protective factor against stress and is linked to improved brain and cognitive function. So getting adequate nutrition is really essential. So proper vitamins, proper minerals, the proper amount of fats, proper amount of carbs, those kinds of things, macro and micronutrients. So avoiding being overweight and obese is a huge protective factor to living a long life. So calorie restriction can help with getting the proper calorie intake to reduce overweight or being overweight and obese. you really need to decide what kind of diet would be appropriate for what you're missing, to say increase fats if that's needed versus carbs if that's needed, versus proteins if that's needed. So both macro and micronutrients, and talking to doctors as you age can help with that process. So with that, health treatments are focusing a lot on late adulthood in trying to expand disease management programs. So trying to do a better job at helping patients manage the chronic illnesses that they have. We've talked about this a few times, that medical science doesn't maybe do as good of a job on chronic illnesses as there is a lot of research on maybe more acute illnesses. So older adults really only receive the necessary medical care about half the time when they have a health problem. All right, so with that, having nurses that are also going through similar things, or who are trained specifically for working with the late adult population, is very helpful. So if you can get special training, or someone who has special training, essentially a specialist is going to help with that special thing that you need. So there's a lot of focus also and research in developing alternative home-based or community care for late adults. So this can be really effective for all ages, but especially for late adults, helping get them involved in their community, having fitness classes, things like that. And also decreasing the percentage of older adults who live in nursing homes is really helpful. So whether that's the community being more involved, whether that is a family being more involved. So we had those examples of the middle adults who had taken in their late adult parents, things like that. So keeping them out of nursing homes tends to help them have the opportunity to engage more with their community, engage more with their family and their friends, and do more to keep themselves occupied, doing things that are purposeful and that they want to be engaged with. One of the biggest factors in survival and the length of survival in a nursing home is actually the patient's self-determination. So how much do they feel that they have control over what's going on around them? How determined are they to do things on their own as well? So 15% of residents who had more choices and felt more control were more likely to be alive 18 months later when they were followed up with, than the 30% who felt less control and more dependent on the staff. So trying to give patients both that opportunity to make choices that are actually meaningful in their lives and determine things about their own lives is really, really helpful. Whether it's that they are actually making very important choices, or that the choices that they do make seem to be very important. So here's a graph of that. Those who were dependent had a much higher mortality rate than those who felt that they had control over their own lives. So with that, this is, again, something that is affected by a lot of different dimensions, a lot of different contexts. So things like education, work, and health. A key point here is that in late adulthood, you either use the capacities you have, or you lose them. So training things like cognitive skills, playing games, bridge, things like that, chess, apps on your phone meant to train your brain, learning a new language. If you're not using a capacity in late adulthood, you will probably be losing it. So that also goes for things like muscles. So you might not be able to completely stop the loss of muscle and bone, but if you're working on that, doing more fitness activities to focus on that, you'll be able to maintain those capacities for a lot longer. So attention. Older adults are less able to ignore distracting information. So things like yoga practice or meditation practice can help with that. This goes for both selective attention, so focusing on a specific aspect of something, and sustained attention, so focusing for a long time. So selective attention might be when I point to the cat in the video. The cat's obviously not here right now. Maybe I should pull my other cat over. See if I can do that. Shut up. Come be in the lecture. So I've now asked you to have selective attention for this cat. He thinks that microphone smells interesting. So that's Shadow. I've asked you to have selective attention on Shadow. And now I'm going to ask you to continue having sustained attention on this lecture in general. So that's what the difference between selective and sustained attention is. So with this, this is also related to memory. So explicit memory, so those facts and experiences that an individual can essentially tell you a story about, that's explicit memory. That declines during age. Episodic memory is the retention of information about the where and when of life's happenings. So I think I kind of mix those together. So explicit memory would be something like, I remember pi out to 8 decimal points or something like that. Myself, I actually don't, but that would be an example. An episodic is like an episode of this is what was happening when and where in life when I went to Disneyland the last time. Semantic memory is the knowledge about the world, things like how to use a spoon, how to shift a car, how to shift a motorcycle, those kinds of things. So implicit memory is, well, we've talked about all these memories before. I'm not sure why I have these in there in such detail. But with that, working memory and the perceptual speed that late adults are working with is declining as they age. So with that, their executive function, which are some of those functions that the prefrontal cortex up here is working on, are declining in older adults. So things like keeping that sustained attention, not getting distracted by other things, like a cat, for example, that I just did, but that's probably just ADHD and not aging. Replacing old and no longer relevant information can be difficult. That's an executive function. You can think of the movie Inside Out. So old, irrelevant information about the presidents in those little memory orbs in the show. The brain janitor people erased them, right? So replacing those with new memories. That's an executive function. It can be harder to do in older adulthood or later adulthood. So decision making is pretty well preserved for older adults, which isn't too surprising. They have had a lot of time in their life to make a lot of decisions and do it well. Especially we see a lot of people who would be said to have wisdom do a really good job at decision making. This goes back, we've talked about wisdom before, and expertise as well. These are kind of related things. So if you have a lot of information, knowledge, wisdom about a specific topic, you're going to be a lot more adept at making a decision in that kind of context. So obviously if you take someone who has spent their whole life engineering computer chips, right? You need to give them a problem in that specific sphere. They're going to be able to make a decision to solve problems really a lot better than if you gave them a problem, say, with the mechanics of a car engine when they've never really worked on that kind of problem before. So, high levels of wisdom are rare. We tend to think of older adults as wise, but actually high levels of wisdom, when we look at both qualitative and quantitative scales, but mostly the quantitative ones, where you might be ranked on wisdom from, say, 1 to 7, 7 being high, 1 being low. Those high levels of wisdom are actually really rare. And late adolescence and early adulthood is actually the main age window for wisdom to first emerge. So if you've got it at that point in late adolescence, early adulthood, it will stay with you, because wisdom is a lot about life experiences, making good decisions, or being able to sort out things. You might say practical wisdom. You might say something like street smarts, relational understanding. These are not really synonyms, but similar enough that hopefully you get an idea. This is what wisdom for researchers are generally looking for. Also, personality-related factors are actually better predictors of wisdom than cognitive factors. So if you're really quick at problem solving, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have wisdom. But if you're, say, more open to new experiences, you will probably be more likely to develop wisdom because you're experiencing a lot of different things versus someone who's not open to new experiences. So, with this education in late adulthood, a lot more people who are in late adulthood are going into getting more education. I would say in just my short time teaching of 6 years, longer, shorter, maybe more. Yeah, 6, 7, maybe even 8 years teaching at the college level. I've seen basically every semester, and at least every year, I have more and more students who are in late adulthood in my classes. So the oldest student I think I've ever had that I knew of, that I actually knew their age, was 86. So that was pretty impressive. With that, many older generations are working more. So part of this might be the economic system that we live in requiring them to work more to simply survive, but some of it can also be that they're working more because it engages them. They found something that they are passionate about, they have purpose towards, and that might be why they're doing it. And it's better if that's the kind of work that they're doing, that it's something they're passionate about, that they find meaning in, that is giving beyond themselves, maybe something that engages them with other people and can build relationships. So that has a lot of positive advantages. So other things, we've talked about this, but other things that you can do to build these mental capacities: reading books, crossword puzzles, going to lectures, or maybe watching things like TED Talks, or learning in other ways, going to concerts. So being open to new experiences, trying out new things, learning new things, that can really help increase cognitive functioning through late adulthood. So with that, these kinds of things can really delay and reduce those kinds of declines that we might expect from late adults. It also lowers the likelihoods of developing things like Alzheimer's disease. So you can train specific cognitive skills. So we've talked about plasticity a bunch of times in this class. So plasticity is that capacity for your brain, for those neurons, to be able to grow those new axon branches, to grow new dendrites, to connect to different places in the brain. So there is a little bit of loss of plasticity in late adulthood, but essentially you have that plasticity, that brain plasticity, that capacity to change and modify your brain all throughout your lifespan. It might be a little slower or a little more difficult after you get past 85, but it is still a capacity. You could teach an 86-year-old a new language. Their brain is plastic enough that it can do that. So this is a really good area for late adults to work in. They might not, say their bones or their muscles might not be able to physically do a whole lot anymore, but if their brain is still at that high capacity, maybe learning these new skills, using those new skills, could be really, really useful. Things like omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids or fish oil can be really, really helpful, especially for that myelin sheath in the neurons, and other nutrition. There's a lot of studies about proper nutrition through aging. So with this, if you're physically fit, if you're engaging your brain, it's going to increase your cognitive function. These all have a cyclical positive upward spiral, or they can. If there's a late adult person who is not engaged, who is not physically active, you will probably see a negative downward spiral of aspects of their body failing, losing cognitive abilities, losing physical abilities. But what we want, as well, for me as a positive psychologist looking at positive aging and thriving, so tying this back to some of the videos from the beginning, is for these older adults to find things that they can do, that they enjoy doing, that will keep them engaged, that will get them doing things that they want, using their bodies, using their minds, for things that they want to do. So with that, that can be related to work, it can be related to retirement. So with that, there are a lot more people today in the workforce than there were before. so that are 75 and older. So this is, this is a fact that I want to talk about specifically. It is in your book, so I was considering maybe skipping it, but for people in other countries, about 33% of those in their 60s and 11% in their 70s are still working, and that's in like a paid kind of job. So it's been a lot higher in the U.S. and it's increasing recently. And an increasing number of adults are beginning to reject early retirement, still working that same job. And like we talked about recently with middle adulthood, there might be some other factors that might be causing some of that decision, as well as just the fact that they might want to keep working. So when older adults do retire, things that are the best for people who are retiring, that keep them healthy and keep them engaged and keep them living longer, are one, being physically healthy, being active, working out, walking, exercising, having an adequate income. I mean, this is a big protective factor for a lot of things throughout the lifespan we've seen. Being better educated is correlated as well with adjusting to retirement well. Connecting with extended social networks and family. So now you're not at work as much. Maybe you have more time to connect with more friends, more family members. Maybe you haven't talked to your cousin for 10 years because, well, you just didn't have the time. You hardly ever see them. They live across the country or something like that. At this point, a lot of older adults who adjust to retirement well are making those kind of connections with people. A lot of these reasons play into the part of why they are satisfied more with their lives before retiring. And then also being flexible about their key plans. So they might have an idea of what retirement might look like, but it might need to look different. As an example, my father-in-law recently retired and had a specific plan of being able to move and do things, get a bigger workshop, for example, to do more woodworking. But because of specific socio-historical factors, a giant virus and pandemic, for example, he wasn't able to do that when he was planning to. So rather, he was flexible enough that he could adjust and do some of those same hobbies that he really wanted to do in the space that he had in a different way. So let's talk about dementia a little bit. It is a neurological disorder, and the primary symptoms involve deteriorating mental functioning. So this kind of goes across the board mentally. So things like memory as well as attention, things like that. Oh, I need to delete some things on my computer clearly. So you can reduce these risks through things like diet, exercise, cognitive training, and maintaining cognitive function. Alzheimer's is a memory disease with the gradual deterioration of memory, reasoning, and language. So for Alzheimer's disease, chlorinase inhibitors and other drugs do help to slow the progression of Alzheimer's. Being supportive emotionally and physically can be very helpful. Being engaged mentally can be really helpful for slowing it. Caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease can be very tough for a family. Imagine a family member who you've known your whole life suddenly doesn't recognize you. That can be really tough. So there are services that provide temporary relief. So they will come a couple days a week and spend a few hours caring for that person with Alzheimer's. So you can get out of the house, hang out with friends, rather than having to be there at all times, as an example. All right, so those were the main points I wanted to hit in this lecture. Feel free to watch the summary here in this YouTube link. We will move on to the socio-emotional factors that are affecting people in late adulthood, and then we'll jump into the end of life and things that might happen after and that are relevant to people who are still around after the end of life as well in chapter 17.